The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Migrating OBIEE to Oracle Analytics Cloud. My name is Michelle Morrill, and I am MindStream Analytics Marketing Director. Before I introduce our presenter today, I'd just like to point out that this session is going to be recorded, so you don't have to try really hard to take notes if we're going a little too fast. Don't worry about that. We'll make sure that we can get a copy of that recording to you. And also, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, just reach out to us. We'll be happy to get that to you also. You are in listen-only mode, so to ask a question during the webinar, please type it into the question box. You'll see it over to the right, and we will be absolutely sure to get your questions answered after the webinar. Today, our presenter is John Liette, MindStream Analytics Product Architect for Business Analytics. So, John, if you are ready, please take it away.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for dialing in for this. As Michelle said, we'll be talking about evaluating OBIEE deployments in terms of considering migrating to Oracle Analytics Cloud. And so I thought I'd best start with a little introduction to myself. So who am I? As Michelle mentioned, I'm a product architect and business intelligence with MindStream Analytics. I've been working in business intelligence for nearly 12 years now, specifically or primarily with OBIEE. And so I started out in the kind of working in the front end of building reports and dashboards for end users, and then kind of gradually moved around between more functional roles like business analyst to more technical roles of learning the ins and outs of modeling data within the repository, data modeling within a database, a little bit detail work, so kind of everywhere in between. And so in today's world, that kind of translates into or leads to a transition into an OAC architect type of role. And so before we get into the meat of the presentation, I'll tell you a little bit about MindStream, just in case you're not familiar with us. MindStream is headquartered in Boston, but we have consultants that are based all over the country. We primarily work in the EPM and BI spaces, so think Hyperion tools, on-premise and in the cloud, and BI with OBIEE and OAC, and several other Oracle tools mixed in as well. We are Oracle Gold Partner, and we also have a managed service practice, which we pair up with other firms in other places in the world, and specifically Switzerland and Australia, to provide 24/7 support for a lot of our clients who let us do everything with them, from help desk activities to monthly maintenance and everything in between. So what we're here for today, talking about evaluating migrating from OBIEE to OAC. So who is it good for? What does it involve? What are the pros and cons, the gives and takes, all of that sort of thing. This will serve as our agenda for the conversation. So I'll start with introducing Analytics Cloud for any of you who aren't familiar with it or aren't up to speed with it, since it's evolved so much in the past year. Then I will talk about who's best suited to migrate from OBIEE to OAC. We'll debunk some common misconceptions or myths about the cloud and OAC specifically. And then using kind of all of that information, we'll talk about what does it really mean to migrate to the cloud? What does that really look like? What does it involve? And that's where we'll sort of wrap things up with kind of the specific discussion of how those migrations proceed. And so the working assumption here is everybody's sort of already familiar with, or is very familiar with, OBIEE. But if you're not, Oracle Business Intelligence Enterprise Edition is Oracle's, what we'll now kind of refer to as their legacy BI platform. So it's an on-premise solution. It's in heavy use, obviously, still today, because that's still where most customers still are. But it provides the ability to access a broad set of data sources, everywhere from a data warehouse to individual data marts to real-time reporting against transactional systems, and kind of everything in between. So the power of OBIEE is taking all those sources, modeling a cohesive, well-designed, well-developed repository or data model that determines how the tool will consume all of that data and present it to end users, so that the actual end users, meaning business users, people who understand business but don't have to understand SQL or how to write queries of that, or anything of that nature, and allow them to pick and choose data based on subject areas and build really either really complex or really clean, simplified visualizations that can be easily distributed and understood by all levels of the organization, whether it's an executive summary report or detailed transactions for kind of frontline analysts to dig through to find insights. So that's OBIEE. So now we'll talk about what is Oracle Analytics Cloud. Now, for most Oracle fans, for lack of a better term, we know that the push over the last several years has been for Oracle to move all of their products to the cloud. So Oracle Analytics Cloud, in a very summed up measure, is Oracle's BI cloud successor to OBIEE. So if you're migrating from OBIEE to a cloud product, OAC is your jam. So there's two primary editions of OAC, there being the standard edition and the enterprise edition. The standard edition actually does not include the business intelligence cloud service component, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what it does include is a tool called Data Visualization Cloud Service and a desktop version of that data visualization tool. That tool serves a lot of the same functionality of OBIEE in terms of presentation and creating visualizations and being intuitive and all of that, but the real difference is that it's more of a lightweight reporting system where you're not required to have a large amount of effort in modeling the data ahead of time, of constructing all of the logical consistencies between your different data elements and all of that. It really allows you to, as a developer or as an analyst, to plug into a data source, establish how the relationships between the objects within your source are, and get to running. So if any of you are familiar with Tableau as a reporting tool, data visualization is kind of Oracle's complementary tool to Tableau in terms of its function and the way that it's positioned. And so it also includes Oracle Smart View, which is important because Oracle Smart View is the primary method of extracting data out of Oracle Essbase. So OAC, one of the big attractive things across the industry is that OAC is the only place to get Oracle Essbase in the cloud. And so Essbase is an old technology, I think it's at this point the original Essbase is something like 30 years ago, but it's still widely used today. And if you're not familiar with it, it's kind of a multi-dimensional cube that kind of aggregates and summarizes data and allows you to slice and dice it by those various dimensions within it. And so the standard edition gives you a cloud version of that, and then the enterprise edition gives you all of those things plus the BI cloud service, an enterprise version of Essbase, which adds some additional features like sandboxing and a couple of others, and a mobile app called Day by Day, which I'll talk more in a moment. So business intelligence cloud service is really where the core functionality that you're used to seeing in OBIEE, that's where it lives in OAC. So your dashboarding, your reporting, you're building out your subject areas, all of that's done through the tool that's referred to as BICS or BICS. And so here's some kind of examples that I'll talk through quickly to give you an idea of what these tools are. So in OAC, here's an example of some insights that someone put together from Data Visualization Cloud Service. And so you can see that it can do things from kind of the more advanced statistical type of analytics visualizations that you see in the upper right. But then you also still have the ability to do things like performance tiles and things that you see on the left, and even kind of more newer, modern types of visualizations like the text maps that you see at the bottom. So that obviously would be good to be able to analyze blocks of text to pick out common terms and how often common descriptors are used in your data set. Essbase in the cloud, as I mentioned, it's not really much to look at because it's primarily a data structure in terms of technology. But the real benefit of it being an OAC is that it's integrated to data visualization and to BICS so that you can use it as a data source to build visualizations off of. In the past, if you're not familiar with Essbase, the probably most common way that users got data from Essbase was via Smart View, which is primarily a Excel plugin. And so you're basically just extracting data into an Excel spreadsheet, and then if you want to build visualizations, you're limited to what Excel can do. That's fine for some people, but for most advanced type of analytics, it's much easier to be able to plug it into a tool like data visualization or BICs. This is a screenshot of the mobile app that's included in OAC that's called Day by Day. This has a really several neat features, and I think probably the subject of, on its own, subject of maybe a future webinar, or you can check out blog posts on it and things of that nature now. But Day by Day really is symbolic of Oracle's commitment to evolving the way that we as users consume data from these types of tools. So if you're not, most people that are listening are probably familiar with how BI lays out dashboards and things, and that's still great. That still is very functional. It works. But what Day by Day does is kind of rethinks that approach subtly in ways that kind of learns lessons from our daily lives. So most of us, really, the way that we consume data as a society anymore is through things like social media. So getting timeline type interfaces where we can scroll through and see different pieces of information that's deemed relevant, using algorithms behind the scenes by those companies like Facebook and Twitter to kind of determine best guesses of what you're most interested in based on a variety of factors. Oracle's kind of looking at modeling their delivery mechanisms that way. So this screenshot is from the tablet version of Day by Day, but even on the phone version, you get like one column where you can scroll through individual insights. You can create new ones just by either typing in the keywords of the data elements or even using voice to text to just tell it what you want, which is awesome for me to think that I can just pick up my phone and say revenue by product by customer and region, Northwest region for 2017, and it be able to present that data in a visualization for me just within seconds. It's really amazing. Then you can tweak it. If it presents it in a visualization that maybe isn't exactly how you want to see it, you can have options to tweak it and change it from different types of charts or change the filter conditions that are applied to it, all of that. And the other one big thing that I wanted to touch on before I clicked off of it was kind of reinvents the way that we think about scheduling. So primarily we think of scheduling in terms of time or based on an event. So primarily usually we'll see reports that are scheduled to run the first of the week or the first of the month, or you know, based on some time in the calendar. Or maybe it's based on some kind of event, like a data load finishes, and that's when I want to see the information. Day by Day gives you built-in functionality to use your device's location to bring back a visualization based on where you are. So say if you're a salesperson in the field and your data is all tied to sales type information, imagine that whenever you're in Baltimore, you get a list of your clients that are in Baltimore and kind of the key metrics for performance or things that you need to know while you're there. Or even specifically while you're at the address of the client that you're visiting, that you get visualizations that are all about that specific client. Information about what their revenue's been like the last quarter or compared to last quarter, or what their recent transactions are, or what have you. Whatever it is that would help you understand what you need to know before walking in the door, it can serve it up for you, which I think is really, really neat. So like I said, we'll probably talk more about Day by Day over the coming months in the form of other webinars and blog posts and other things you'll see us on social media. And so here's an example of Analytics Cloud, the BICS functionality. So if you are familiar with OBIEE, especially 12C, this will look right at home for you. It almost could have been a screenshot just from 12C. If you're familiar with OBIEE, you'll feel right at home in terms of using it and developing in it, in terms of the reports and the dashboards. Most of the functionality is now live in OAC that you would get in 12C. It's not perfect parity, and I'll hit on a couple of the key points of that later in the presentation, but know that you will feel comfortable there. It is obviously built based on the 12C code base, and so the things that you would do there, largely you'll find to be the same in OAC. So now I wanted to take a moment to kind of debunk some myths or misconceptions about OAC and somewhat the cloud in general, or the Oracle Cloud in general. And so some of these are misconceptions that kind of came to be in some circles because of maybe sales speak, or you know, Oracle not being clear in some cases about what it can do or what it will do, or so forth. Or maybe it's some things that just were always misconceptions, Or maybe there are some things that used to be true, but now they're not. And so now we need to make sure that everybody understands where the playing field is now. Because one thing that I do want to iterate is how committed Oracle has been in the past year to evolving OAC as a product and as a suite. So Oracle, the Analytics Cloud was released, I think, March of last year. So we're coming up on this 1-year anniversary. But there were some key features that, from an enterprise perspective, we'd like to see that weren't there, that are there now. There are tools that have been added. There are releases all the time that are adding new features and correcting bugs and things of that nature. And so it's really impressive to me as someone who works with these tools every day to see the level of effort that Oracle has been able to demonstrate through all of those things to really making OAC its flagship BI product and really building everything around it. So it is important also to remember that that is the case, that all of the new development, all the new investments and research and things are going to OAC. So you'll see new features make it to OAC before they get backfilled into the cloud or the on-premise versions, excuse me. Cloud first, then on-premise. So the first misconception that I want to talk about was something that was always on my mind when we first started talking about OAC was, what if there's a client that has, and I think most clients do this, if they have an external LDAP provider configured in their OBIEE environment, like Microsoft Active Directory, which I think probably 90% of the BI implementations that I've ever worked on have been integrated to Active Directory. The misconception is that I can't do that because I'm in the cloud and my Active Directory is on my private network internally to my organization, and I don't want everybody to have their own Oracle Cloud account and have to manage a new set of IDs and passwords and juggle another set of expiration dates for when they expire, and I have to remember to change them and keep them in sync with all my other passwords or whatever my methodology is for keeping all of that sane. But the truth is that OAC fully features the ability to connect to an external LDAP provider like Active Directory, and it enables users to use their network credentials to access OAC and have their security provision based on that ID and all of that. So the way that Oracle can do that is, if you're a net new OAC customer, you'll get access to a tool called Identity Cloud Service, which is Oracle's relatively new identity provider for all of their cloud products. So the idea is, obviously from Oracle's perspective, the ideal customer is going to have OAC, they're going to have planning and budgeting on the cloud, they're going to have supply chain and human capital management, all of those. And IDCS, or the Identity Cloud Service, is meant to service all of those. And so if you have one ID, you can be provisioned to any of those that your organization has rights to. And so that IDCS tool can be configured with a function that's called an identity bridge, if you wanted to Google it. That's the quickest way to get information on it. But essentially what it does is it installs the best term for a plugin, if you will, on your Active Directory server that then can talk to IDCS, and you can control how that information is synced across if you want it based on specific groups, so you're not syncing your entire organization to the cloud, and you only want to restrict it to the users that should have access to OAC. You can configure how often it gets synced. So if you have a large pool and you want to limit it to only be accessed during off hours or something, you can control all of that through that feature called an identity bridge. There's also, if you purchased OAC sometime last year, there used to be an option to buy OAC that was called a non-metered version. So I don't want to get into the technical licensing discussion with OAC, but now when you buy OAC, Oracle asks you to use this system they call universal credits, where you essentially buy credits to be applied to your usage. So all of your usage in OAC is metered, and so that means that you pay for what you use, which is great in a lot of cases. But they used to sell a version that was called a non-metered version, where you just paid a flat fee every month to have access to the tools. And it's not widely publicized, I think, mostly because Oracle has gotten away from that licensing model, and so they don't want to highlight it too much. But even in that case, IDCS is not compatible with your environment. We learned through working with a customer who has a non-metered application. But there are other ways specific to integrate with an Active Directory, specifically with using a SAML authentication method, which is networking speak. It kind of goes beyond my expertise, but Oracle fully supports it and it's documented. It's all out there if you're looking for it. So the second misconception that I wanted to talk about was, thinking that as a client, I really don't want to use OAC because I don't have the bandwidth to move my entire data warehouse and all of my processes to the cloud. And OAC sounds like a cool tool, but I'm not moving my 10 terabyte data warehouse and all the processes that populate it and changing all of the downstream processes that consume data from it. That's just too much and it's not worth it. The truth is, Oracle supports configuring a VPN to connect your OAC environment to your on-premise data center. And why that's important is you can still have your data in your data warehouse and use OAC to connect to it as a data source, provided that VPN connection is established. That opens up a whole new world of thinking, at least it did for me, for thinking about who can use OAC and what its limitations are. It removes a lot of the hurdles that would be in many of our clients' way, because you're not asking to take on the Herculean effort of redoing everything or migrating everything. You're now able to leave the data pieces in place, leave all that architecture that I've worked, in some cases it might have been there for years or even over a decade at this point, leave that where it is and just use OAC as the reporting tool that connects to it. And then you can decide, if it makes sense to, for a variety of reasons, and your finances or whatever, if it makes sense to migrate to the Oracle Cloud Database as my primary data sources eventually, you can take those as they come. Or you can take an iterative approach and only move a certain piece at a certain time so that you're not having to take on the cost of resources to move everything from one to the other all up front. And then the third misconception I wanted to highlight too is this is specifically for folks who are really understanding OBIEE as it is today. This misconception that my data model is way too complex for OAC and I don't want to have to pare it down to be able to fit it in. The truth is that OAC supports lifting and shifting your repository from your existing environment to OAC and being able to use it with all the features that are already in there. And so just to back up and kind of explain this, when Bix was released as a standalone and with OAC now, Oracle gives you access to a web browser UI-based data modeler. In the on-premise world, we've always used the BI administration client, which is a fat client that's installed on a developer's machine or on a shared server that all the developers log into or what have you. But basically, it's its own piece of software in the on-prem world, always has been. And it can allow you to build simple data models or really complex data models with multiple sources, defining logical hierarchies, being able to configure use of aggregate tables, a whole host of really in-depth control that you have over that data model. And in OBIEE world, that's really what made, well, one of the things that made OBIEE so viable as an enterprise solution was that it could handle so many different scenarios and so many situations because of the power of that administration tool. That web-based UI that Bix and now OAC delivers doesn't have that depth of functionality or near the parity that it would have with the administration tool. And so Oracle's response is when OAC was released, they released a new version of the administration tool. And when I say a new version, like it literally is just like a new point release. It looks the same, feels the same, but it allows you to support all of those complex, heavy, complicated features that you find in the on-premise repository. And so that means that when you go to the cloud, you're not now having to be saddled with, well, how do I simplify or how do I pick which data model I'm going to put into the cloud? Now you can have the comfort of knowing that your repository can be just picked up and moved there as it is. Or if you are a net new, that you can use it to build something more complicated. And so now I want to transition and talk about who is best suited to migrate from OBIEE to OAC. And so early on when I was still holding on to some of those misconceptions that I just mentioned, my old thinking with this was, well, OBIEE is really good for anybody who's got a new data source because they don't want to have to rework stuff. If they got something really simple because of that web-based GUI that's not real deep, and just want some way to get my foot in the door of analytics and start building from there iteratively. But that's really based on kind of outdated and/or incorrect notions about Bix, that it was limited based on those other factors. And so my new line, when somebody asks me, like, who's really best suited to migrate in terms of OBIEE customers today? And my answer really is anyone. I think with the ability to drop your existing repository from on-prem into the cloud or building a new one, being able to VPN so that you have your environment to be able to connect, your OAC environment to connect to your on-premise data centers, those really allow a more enterprise solution to be built from this cloud product that wasn't there when those things weren't the case. It included a big piece of that is the Active Directory piece. I think for a lot of enterprise clients, it wouldn't necessarily be a deal killer to have to create their own cloud accounts and things of that nature rather than using their Microsoft Active Directory network accounts. But it surely is a big pain to have to manage all of those. And it would be a big setback in the eyes of some of their users. And so being able to say, yes, we can use your existing credentials today, that's a big win for a lot of users in a sense that you may not think of in terms of when you're thinking about moving to the cloud. The second bullet point that's kind of sandwiched in here is also important in that OAC is positioned as a platform as a service. And what that means from Oracle's perspective is that what you're subscribing to is the platform. So that means that you have operating system access to the servers that that host OAC. And so you can actually go in, and it's all based on Linux. So when you have your Linux developers, and if you're not, then you can get people that are skilled up, get trained up on Linux. But you can go in, you can run scripts. In some cases you have to, which we'll mention a scenario of that in a few moments. But being able to have a lot more control there, where the BICS, just the BICS piece, is available as a standalone tool and has been for several years. That standalone tool is based on older code. It's actually based on 11G code, but it is an example of a software as a service. So remember, OAC is a platform as a service, where Oracle's giving you kind of the servers, they're hosting all of the hardware, they're maintaining all the hardware, but in a software as a service, you as a user, you as an administrator within your organization don't have access to all that behind the scenes stuff. You're basically just given the software, BICS, and you're restricted to using what's in there. Now, for some cases, that's great. Some people don't need all of the deep configurations, but what I found in my years is that, especially for larger organizations, those enterprise type supportability require that deeper level of access to be able to configure how the server's running, be able to configure settings around caching and other performance type of things that need to be managed. And so OAC gives that to you because it is a platform as a service. Oracle handles the hardware, maintaining it from a physical perspective. When patches roll out, you just get an alert. The administrator gets an alert that a patch is available, and that allows you to essentially click a button to have it applied when you're ready for it. It doesn't push them and knock users off at a certain time or anything like that. So it's really kind of striving to be, and in many cases is kind of the best of both worlds in terms of giving you the access and the flexibility that you need as an enterprise, while also taking the headache away of having to have full-time resources applied, to spend a week doing a patch or whatever it ends up being sometimes. And so with all that said, what would be the largest factor in determining if I, as an OBIEE customer today, am a good strategic fit for OAC? And this answer may seem kind of obvious, but for me, it all comes down to finances. And like I said, that's kind of obvious in a lot of cases that the best tools or the best strategies are all dependent on what we're constricted by in terms of our resources. Often one of them is, or the biggest one, is finances. But specifically, I call it out here because we've spoken with multiple clients, or we've worked with multiple clients who are in situations where they're determining whether they want to move or not, and it really comes down to they're in scenarios where they're still on 11G, their licensing agreement is up for renewal, and I forget all the details around the licensing constraints or whatever, but for whatever reason, they were essentially at a crossroads where they either had to migrate to 12C on-premise or go straight to Analytics Cloud. And all of the other things in mind, that all of the great things that OAC can do, all of that's great, but what it ultimately came down to is doing a cost evaluation with Oracle and finding out that it was better for them financially to migrate to the cloud rather than go to 12c. Now, obviously, even if you do go to 12c, there's that idea that in the future, whether it's 5 years from now, 8 years from now, you're probably going to be migrating again to get to the cloud eventually. And so if you are at that kind of crossroads, that's the other thing to keep in mind, in addition to finances, or in addition to the current state of finances, is the long-term prospect of what finances are in terms of licensing, and thinking about maybe I should just get to OAC now. There are some additional considerations and differences between OAC and OBIEE that I wanted to highlight here. And the biggest one for me is the delivers piece. So OBIEE has a functionality that's called delivers. It has objects that are called agents that allow you to have pretty fancy control over how reports and dashboards can be scheduled and distributed. And so it allows you to define what you're going to run, when it's going to run, who or where it gets sent to, whether it's via email or to a shared file or sent via an alert or what have you, things of that nature. That's all. It also has conditional, and the on-premise has a conditional aspects to the agents where you can determine if this data set runs and it returns no records, then we're done, don't do anything else. But if it returns some records that tell me something wrong, then run these 6 other reports and send it to John so that John can take action on whatever the issue is that this is identifying. OAC is not quite there yet, but it's one of the things that Oracle has on their short list of things they're investing in and working on. Today in OAC, if you have the BI reports, the data visualization, you can email them, you can set them up on a schedule basis. It's not as in-depth and robust as what you get in the on-premise version. There's not an actual agent type object there yet, but it's one of those things that I think will be there in the near future. It also, OBIEE on-premise also has built-in features that are primarily aimed at an integration with marketing tools that can generate marketing lists and segments. Those are not as part of OAC, and neither are the pre-built forms to build out KPIs and scorecards that you can find in OBIEE. Now, obviously, with using visualizations and things, there are ways to kind of get that functionality roundabout by using those things, but there's not the shortcut, for lack of a better description, the wizard type of way of getting to a KPI or scorecard in OAC yet. BI Publisher is listed here, but it's actually crossed out because as of December 2017, BI Publisher is now part of OAC. So thinking back to one of the first slides that I showed you, should be updated to include BI Publisher in the list of tools that are included in the Enterprise Edition of OAC. And so this is a big win because if you're not familiar with BI Publisher, it's a tool that's been integrated tightly with OBIEE since 11G, so for several years. But Oracle calls it a pixel perfect reporting tool. But what that means is it's a narrative style reporting tool. It can connect to your BI data sources. It can connect to its own data sources. And it extracts data in the form of XML and then uses a template that you configure within Microsoft Word to control how that data gets presented. So you can have annotations and text and narrative type aspects to a report, or you can even use it to generate really printable visualizations or reports, or even documents. You can use, some folks even use it to generate statements and invoices, which is a flavor of, or an aspect of reporting that OAC was missing until that showed up. But it's also really great because it's an example of Oracle's ability to continually develop OAC, adding an entirely new tool set to the suite and not requiring a user to buy it as an add-on or whatever. Like I mentioned before, when updates happen, you get an alert as an administrator, and on your dashboard where you're managing the environments, you have a button to click to deploy a patch. And in this case, when the administrator did that, as of December, the next version that was released didn't just have bug fixes and stuff, it also included an entirely new tool set with BI Publisher, which I think is fantastic. So with some of these things in mind, what does it really mean to migrate to the cloud? So maybe I'm a good candidate, but what does it really entail? What is that going to look like for me? And so for most enterprise implementations, migrating to the cloud is really going to mean creating a hybrid on the cloud, on-premise solution. And so this is really a broad generalization, but you could think of that your analytics is going to be in the cloud. If you have planning, supply chain management, human capital management, those other Oracle Cloud applications, those would all be in the cloud. You could have, optionally, an Oracle Cloud database. Well, OAC requires you to have an OAC or an Oracle Cloud database to support the application. So if you're a techie or you're familiar with how OBIEE is architecture today, there's databases that run behind the scenes just to support the tool running. So you have to have a subscription for that, but you're not required to have your whole data structure in Oracle Cloud database. Which is why you can have a hybrid solution where your analytics, your planning, all of that stuff is in the cloud, but on premise you still have your LDAP provider like Active Directory, your data warehouse is there, or even some real-time data sources where if you haven't migrated to the cloud or they don't have a cloud sibling yet. For example, we're working with a client who still has HFM on premise. That wasn't a good fit for them to migrate at this time. But using that VPN connection, they can still connect to HFM to get real-time information about transactions that are happening through that system. And so the image here is provided by Oracle. It's really just an illustration of the VPN or a sample VPN configuration between OAC and an on-premise network. So you can see on the left the servers that are within Oracle Cloud that are connected to the data center with a technology that's called a Corrente VPN. Oracle actually supports a whole list of VPN. I think there's a dozen or so different technologies, which is really great because a lot of enterprise level infrastructure already has some type of VPN in place, and the odds are that whatever you're already using is probably supported for this too, which is great because that means there's likely people within your organization who are familiar with it, understand it, know the ins and outs of it, that can help you with cooking up OAC this way as well. So imagine, yes, I'm on board. What does it actually take to migrate to the cloud? And I like to really emphasize how much of it is planning ahead of time of what your hybrid is going to look like. Because the first thing you do when you get a subscription is establish your VPN connections and your LDAP or other identity providers. Those are all required as a first step, as a prerequisite before you even deploy your actual analytics instances. And so what that means is that you have, or it helps really, to have a really clear idea of what that infrastructure is going to look like, how they're going to be interconnected and related, so that when you do deploy those different components, you're not having to go back and rework anything. And that's actually something that we're working with a lot of clients on now. And so if that's something that you're interested in getting an idea of, an advisory type of consultation on what that would look like for you, MindStream is available, and we can help you with that, like we have several others in the past. And so now to kind of drive this home, we'll talk about kind of some of the methods to migrate. This is a very high level. It's not a real deep technical discussion. Those details are available if you're interested. But the high level kind of process for the actual migration, aside from the planning piece, is for 12c, there's a functionality that's built in that's been there since 12c was released called a bar file. And so what that is a file that can be generated that exports the security model, the web catalog, the repository into a single file. And so within 12c, that's great because you now have an option, an ability to take that snapshot, if you will, of your environment and export it, and you can use that for backup and recovery purposes, or you can use that for migrating entire environments, or if you needed to spin off new environments, you can use that to quickly stand up the new ones. But OAC can take advantage of that because it can consume that same bar file and upload it to OAC as a snapshot. And so then that brings all of those things into OAC, the web catalog, the repository, so all of your reports, all your dashboards, all of your subject areas, your security model, including users, roles, and groups, all of that is made available in OAC just through that process. And so that process alone, just migrating is incredibly short. Depending on the volume of your data, it might take an administrator an hour to move that. Sometimes a little more if you run into any kind of hiccups or nuanced things that could throw hurdles at you. But in general, that specific piece can be surprisingly short. all of the really heavy lifting goes into the planning stages of laying out and designing what your architecture is going to look like, and then the validation and testing pieces that we'll talk about in a second. So 11G is slightly different. So 11G doesn't have the concept of the bar file. And so what Oracle has created is a process to migrate that essentially is a manual way of generating that extract. And so OAC comes packaged with some tools that will generate a migration script for you. And so you'll take that generated script from the OAC environment that, again, you can access because it's a platform as a service and you have operating system level access to it. And you can take that script that it generates and put it on your 11G server, run it. It will capture your web catalog, repository, all the security information into a file that's kind of mimicking the functionality of that bar file for 12C. You can place that resulting export back onto the OAC server, so you can use PuTTY or whatever other method of logging into that environment to copy files as such over. Excuse me. And then on OAC, there's a script that you can run to import all of those features into OAC. And then you're essentially back to where you were, the same spot as if you were coming from 12C. And so after that, obviously, like I mentioned, a large effort can be planned on validating objects, data sources, security. All of that needs to be rigorously checked just to make sure that you are completely in sync between your OAC environment and what you had on premise. This is specifically true of the data connections, which not necessarily are because they have issues migrating, but they might have just changed just based on the architectural decisions that you've made. You may have to redefine how you make connections between certain data sources, or if those data sources you've decided to move, like if you've decided to migrate certain data marts or what have you to an Oracle Cloud database, you'd have to make sure that you updated your data sources to access those correctly. So we'll kind of wrap up here, and I wanted to kind of drive home three main things that I really wanted you to take away from this conversation. The first being that OAC is Oracle's flagship BI product. All the new development, all the new enhancements, all the new features and functionality, all of it is being focused on OAC. Some things will eventually make their way back into the on-premise tools, but by and large, OAC is where Oracle's vision for the future of BI lives. And we need to keep that in mind, that's going to be at the forefront. A lot of that upgrade and things that's been happening has worked out extremely well over the last year. The second point is kind of ties into that OAC is rapidly acquiring new features and functionality that make it more viable than ever for an enterprise implementation. And it's really important because I think, especially early on, OAC, and deservedly so, built this reputation of it's not quite ready for that enterprise level of implementation yet. But really over the last year, between being able to access on-prem sources, being able to use on-prem authentication, really makes this set up to be a really strong candidate to be an enterprise BI tool. And then the third thing is that it's really important to understand your environment. Some users are really intimate, or some decision makers are really intimate with their BI tools, that they really understand the ins and outs of it. They were really involved with the development over years. Some aren't. Some are kind of disconnected. And so it's really important to understand from all levels of your organization that the analyzing and planning your migration may require as much, or in some cases even a lot more, effort than the actual migration itself. So obviously that varies on case to case, but what we found is that those discussions, those thinking it through, making sure that what we're putting in place is something that's really going to serve you well for an enterprise, that's where a lot of that value is, or where a lot of that effort goes into your OAC migration project as a whole. And so with that, we'll wrap up. I thank you all for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
Hey, thank you, John, for that great presentation. Folks, please reach out if you have questions for John. If you ask questions during the webinar, we'll be sure to get back to you shortly. Here's our contact information on the screen. So if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, or a link to the webinar, which we've recorded. We can get that off to you. We appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.